Hello, my name is Rhianna McIsaac, and today I'm going to be analyzing Eleanor Roosevelt's speech, The Struggle for Human Rights. She makes this speech to the United Nations in 1948, and in her speech she urges them to fulfill their previous promise to promote human rights and equality and to uphold the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was basically an agreement between the members of the UN to promote general human rights globally. Some quick examples of this would be their promise to promote equality between men and women and between races. Eleanor Roosevelt was a well-known political figure who constantly promoted women's rights and human rights throughout her life. Roosevelt is trying to persuade her audience to work on strengthening the influence of the UN as well. Roosevelt effectively uses a mixture of ethos, pathos, and logos to promote her point in her argument. The use of ethos in her argument is both implied and unimplied. The implied aspect of the ethos is in Roosevelt's background. She comes from a very prominent political family, and she was the wife of the President of the United States at the time that this speech was delivered. In these ways, her credibility was implied. Another way that she proves her credibility in the speech is by referencing how she knows other world leaders. To quote her, she says, "And I have known some of our leaders." By referencing other world leaders, she's giving her argument more credibility. She's also giving herself more credibility. She is around these other important people, therefore making her more credible and also more important. Another thing that referencing other world leaders does for her argument is it makes it clear what Roosevelt's place in society was at the time. She belongs among those leaders. She was able to talk to them and to share ideas with them, and she is reminding the audience of her basic power and influence by doing this. Another thing that gives her argument credibility is the events that had recently occurred before this speech took place. The speech was given in 1948, so not long after World War II was over, and there are multiple reasons that the Allies won in World War II, but the United States joining forces with them was arguably one of the more important factors that led to their victory. And this is a fact that, all the people present at the United Nations meeting would definitely, be aware of. So Roosevelt uses pathos in her argument to support her point as well. It can be seen in some of the words she chooses to use to support her argument. An example of this would be the words, freedom and life. Word choice in any speech is very important to the message that the speaker is trying to send. Arguably, all words have emotional connotations that make them either, good or bad. An example of this would be the words arts and then the word crafts. When one hears the word arts, they might think of a famous painting, like Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. On the other hand, when one hears the word crafts, they'll most likely think of like a silly little drawing, that like maybe your high school art teacher made you do. However, if you look at the words themselves, they mean basically the same thing. So by using positively charged words to illustrate her point, Roosevelt effectively outlines a brighter future for the world. So doing so makes the actions that she's trying to urge the world leaders at the United Nations to, do seem even more urgent and important. So lastly, Roosevelt uses logos in her argument to support her point. Logic is the main way in which Eleanor Roosevelt argues her case in this speech. I would argue that the entirety of her speech is basically an if-then statement. And a clear example of this would be when she discusses the democratic process and states, "We accept the slow processes of democracy because we know that shortcuts compromise principle on which no compromise is possible." So basically, what Roosevelt is saying is that if we make shortcuts during the democratic process, we will then lose some of the core principles behind the ideals we are trying to include, in our government or in whatever law is being proposed at the time. This is a logical argument and is seen throughout the entirety of her speech. To conclude, Roosevelt effectively uses all forms of rhetorical persuasion in her speech to other world leaders in the UN. I believe whether or not she succeeded in her goal is up to individual interpretation, because while the UN today does concern itself with human rights issues, I would argue that it doesn't always do a great job of stepping in when a human rights violation occurs. And after doing some brief research on the UN's peacekeeping programs, they do have good ideas that do support their mission, which is, to promote human rights. But there doesn't seem to be much evidence of them restricting governments or other outside organizations from committing human rights violations. Due to this, I would say that Eleanor Roosevelt succeeded in steering the United Nations towards being primarily concerned with equality, which was her goal. All right, thank you.